Welcome back, everyone. I wanted to take a look today at the Russian Revolution and how Russia was a bit of an anomaly in what led to the rise of communism at the turn of the 20th century. During the later part of the 19th century, Russia had 120 million people, which was roughly about 8% of the world's total population. So it was a vast region, and it comprised about one-fifth of the world's habitable landmass. As you can see here, it spreads all the way from Europe all the way to Asia. And this is going to be key in understanding some of the changes that are happening in Russia around the early part of the 20th century, because in some ways they identified with a lot of European values, but in other ways they were also very Asian as well. And so that difference is going to play into some of the key characteristics that we've been talking about. A couple weeks ago, we examined the idea of nationalism and how nations try to unite one another under a common language, a common culture, a common background, a common heritage. And that was extremely difficult in Russia because you have different languages. You have hundreds of different languages in Russia at the time. You have all these different pockets of groups of people that were loosely held together by some type of, sentiment of Russia, but they didn't really share a lot of the same cultural heritages with one another. And so they were disparate people in very separate locations, and so they didn't necessarily have that sense of nationalism, at least at the turn of the century, that we generally think of within the West. Another problem that Russia faced at the turn of the 20th century was that Russia was politically and economically behind the Western world about 150 years. And so a lot of the changes that were happening in Europe, as far as political revolutions and economic revolutions, were late to hit Russia. And so we're going to see some of those changes beginning to manifest, beginning to rise in the 20th century within Russia, what's going to lead to the Russian Revolution. Just to give you some context to some of the changes that Russia was behind, one of them was the political revolutions that were brought about by the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution really signaled a clear change for the modern world, where people were demanding a voice within the government. They were demanding limitations on government authority, suggesting that the government should have rules that it follows, what it can do and what it can't do, and that people should have certain inalienable rights that the government can't take from them, or at least without a cause. And Thomas Jefferson boldly declared in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning that anyone should be able to see them, these truths, that all men are created equal. And so the idea that each person is equal was a different concept that kind of forges this modern political thought, rather than seeing the king and queen as separate, as different, as divine. What they're arguing is that everyone is born essentially equal to another person. And I mean, we take a look at that, in the 21st century, and we think, well, that's just the way it is. But if you think about this within the 18th century context, when that's not what they grew up with, that wasn't the mindset for the last several centuries, then that was a very radical concept, and I can only imagine what King George III of England thought about when he read that line by Jefferson, that everyone is equal to him. In his mind, he was given authority by God, divine authority to rule over God's children, and therefore his rules were like God's rules, and disobeying the king was like disobeying God. And so seeing this document, I mean, at first he may have laughed when he heard these colonialists who he sees as his subjects, but he sees a little bit lesser than his regular subjects because they were in America, so they had less of a concern in his mind than people that were actually in England at the time. Declaring that they were equal to him. And so his first thought probably was dismissive, and then the second thought was, well, this is treason, right? Not only is this treason, this is blasphemy. This is something that's defying tradition. It's something that's defying what God has given me the right to do. And as God's enforcer, I must, put down this insurrection. This is, treason. And so it was a radical concept. And if the colonialists lost, that they would have been, hung and executed, and whatever else, in order to set an example that this is what happens when you defy the king and you defy God. And so it was a radical concept, but it turned out that the Americans did eventually win the war and imposed a new form, a modern form of government, which suggested that people should have the right to vote, imposing classical ideals from ancient Greece, this idea of democracy, or at least a form of democracy, where people have a voice within the government. So the idea with this is that the government should then listen to the people. At least that's how it works in theory. And then another kind of safety mechanism that they developed was the system of checks and balances, by separating different branches of government and giving each branch of government different powers. Ensures that no one can get too much power. Again, that's the theory behind it. And then giving each branch of government oversight over to the other ones ensures that there's going to be less corruption. And so the executive, legislative, and judicial branches were designed in order to try to put control mechanisms on the government to limit their power. And so that was the founding element that's going to lead to the modern world. And the French people were inspired by this, and they too sought to remove their king and implement a democracy and guarantee the rights to its citizenry. The French Revolution is kind of more of a nuanced and complex discussion. In some ways, it's much more interesting than the American Revolution, although the American Revolution is interesting in its own right. The French Revolution just didn't happen overnight. There's actually periods of time where the revolution happened in certain phases. And if you're more interested in that, I recommend that you take Humanities 202, which we get into that in a lot more detail. But the main idea that I want you to get from this, right, some of the changes that were happening, bringing humanity into the modern world in the 18th century, was this idea of democracy, the voice of the people, the demand for equality, the equal rights of the people, and the limitation of the government. And although there weren't really as big and violent of revolutions in Europe happening, there were these changes that were happening in the 19th century, which were bringing about these political reforms. And so most of Europe started following suit, except for Russia. So we're going to see people start demanding for similar ideals when we get into the 20th century. And so this is kind of laying the foundation, the groundwork for understanding what's going to happen with the Russian Revolution. Another major change that happened in the 19th century, another revolution, was the Industrial Revolution. So I want to talk a little bit about the economic changes that were happening, in addition to the political changes that happened several years before, about a century before. And just taking a look at the Industrial Revolution, what mainly happened was that people were leaving their hometowns. We talked a little bit about this when we were taking a look at modern art and Munch's The Scream, where people were flocking from their rural, their agrarian communities where they lived for centuries into the cities in order to find stable work, a regular paycheck that they can have, because if you're a farmer, you only get paid once a year, and it depends upon the weather. But if you're working in a factory, you get paid every week, and it doesn't really depend upon the weather, so it's much more stable. And so people were seeking what we call in the United States the American dream, but where if you're not in the United States, they generally call it the bourgeoisie dream. Same idea as this idea of class mobility. They were seeking this economic prosperity, and they saw that the changes in the 19th century were access to this prosperity. And so people were flooding to the cities in order to seek out this dream and make their mark on the world. And I just wanted to show you some statistics here. Not that these statistics will be on the test, but it just shows you some of the changes that were happening in the 19th century. If you take a look at Paris, for instance, in 10 years, from 1851 to 1861, it grew 33%, then 13, then 27, then 8, and then 8%. And so in about 50 years, it grew about 120% in its population size. And so, what I want you to think about is what might be some problems that would happen as a result of these growing cities. And in London, we see even bigger changes, right? From 1841 to 1861, roughly 20 years, you see a 40% increase, and then another 20 years, you see a 36% increase, then 10%, and by the end of the 19th century, you see a 55% increase. And so London increases over about 60-year period about 244%. And so you have to think about what kind of infrastructure is going to be needed in order to keep up with that population. What might be some of the strains that's happening within that. And if you take a look at New York, it's even more extreme as people were heading to the New World, quote unquote, seeking to kind of make their way in the world and find that bourgeoisie dream, because the part of the propaganda was America had streets paved with gold, which is this idea of the opportunity, and so is the melting pot where people of diverse backgrounds and diverse cultures were coming together and meeting and uniting and working together, so that there was this dream that America was going to bring this prosperity, and so this brought a lot of immigrants at the turn of the century. That brought changes to the U.S. landscape. If we take a look at some of these changes in a 10-year period, it grew 84%, right, from 320,000 to 590,000, and then again 69%. It grew in another 10 years, 40% in another 10 years, and then 35%, 36%, and then 46%. And so roughly, New York grew in a 60-year time frame about 1,000%, and that is huge, right? So if we take a look at perhaps Rexburg with some of these changes, if I just kind of did a hypothetical here of Rexburg, which has a population of about 28, maybe 29,000, at least 28,000 according to 2017 statistics. We can see that how that's going to kind of affect maybe on a lesser scale than New York, but at least we can think about some of the changes. So some of you that have been to Rexburg and gone to campus here can kind of think about what kind of strain this would have on the current population that we have, right? So in 2017, 28,000, and then we grow another 10 years to 52,000, then 88,000, 123,000, 166,000, and then by 2077, 330,000, right? So we take those changes and apply them to a smaller area. We have to think about what kind of problems that would occur as a result of this. What kind of problems would Rexburg face with this population boom? And those of you that have lived in Rexburg already know that the population strain is already being felt here, as far as trying to find housing, trying to find an apartment here sometimes is really tricky. And what happens when there is a large demand and a limited supply? Those of you that take in economic classes, right? When the supply is low and the demand is high, the prices go up. And so in Rexburg, you have to pay a lot more for the housing here, because there's a huge demand to live here with all the students coming, a lot of faculty coming. And so there's a huge demand. And then think about that, right? So you have to pay high costs in housing. And then you also, on the other side of this, you have to think about how you're going to get income. So if you have a large student population and not a lot of stores or businesses to work in, what's going to happen to the pay, right? So if you have a large supply of people wanting work and a small demand of not that many businesses to offer that many jobs, what's going to happen to the price of wages, or at least the size of wages is going to go down. And so you have massive, increase of rent versus the decrease in wages, and so there's a huge gap that's happening. And so one of the major problems that they're seeing at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century is some massive poverty that we have. This is Degas' Absinthe Drinker. I think I talked a little bit about this one in a previous lecture, where she's coming in to deaden the pain of her kind of modern existence with a very potent alcoholic drink called absinthe. But what Degas is depicting here is some of the problems, the idea that urbanization, these economic changes are going to bring about prosperity and economic wealth and opportunity. It's not the case because people are forced into these high rent situations with low pay. And so the hopes and the dreams and the aspirations that they thought that they were going to find within the 19th century and into the 20th century just weren't there. And so you see a rise of alcoholism is going to be one of the major problems that were on the rise. Another one is because with the massive cost of rent and the low wages, you have women turning to more of the nightlife kind of seedy elements in order to pay for rent, and so you have the problems with some of the crime activities that were on the rise. Sanitation is also one of the major problems that's happening as a result of these economic changes in the 19th century. This was known as the Great Stink in London, where the River Thames was polluted to a point where all of the sewer and garbage was being collected in the river, and an unusually hot summer and muggy summer made the smell of human waste and excrement unbearable. And so you have this cartoon depicting that particular time in 1855, where you have some type of swamp man emerging from the River Thames. You can see all of the kind of dead animals that are floating in the river, and then you have this very wealthy gentleman with his coattails and his top hat, and giving him, I guess, a card or something saying, I guess, "Thou dost stinketh," or something like that. Just to represent some of the modern problems with sanitation that people are going to have to figure out, some of the changes that they're going to face. And I want to take a look at Karl Marx. He's also going to be a key element to the changes that are happening in Russia. And Karl Marx was living in England at the time of this tremendous economic and urbanization changes that we see. And what he saw is that people were living in the streets because of the skyrocketing housing that increased by more than 40% in a short amount of time, where people again were flooding for that economic stability. And he found that this promise of capitalism to solve all the problems, this mindset of if we can just eliminate regulation and allow the industry to correct itself, he's suggesting that it's not quite that simple. That those that are the most vulnerable are going to be the most exploited under this current circumstance, right? So the ones that really can't afford their own housing or that are living paycheck to paycheck are going to be the ones that are going to really be affected negatively, whereas those that are the business owners that are the wealthy, they can, they're the ones that are owning the housing, they're the ones that are collecting the rent, and they're the ones that are paying the lowest amount of wages for their workers. And so they're kind of living their own kind of dream, whereas the people that, the day-to-day people were severely affected in a negative way. One extreme example of housing, what's going on in London, was known as Goodge Place, Goodge Place. It's just a little apartment complex there that had about 27 apartments. But it was estimated at the time that 485 people lived in this one small apartment complex. And so think about some of the small apartment complexes that we have in Rexburg and put 485 people in there. That's an average of 18 people per apartment. And so, you guys think that you have it bad with 4 or 5 people in your apartment. Think about having about 12, 13, 14 more people kind of crammed into that location. And this is pre indoor plumbing. This is pre where people would have gas stoves and things like that. So it meant that people were living on top of one another. And so Karl Marx saw this. He saw people living in the streets, and he just says, you know what, this system can't last very long. And so he's predicting that eventually there's going to be a revolution that overthrows capitalism. And so the Russians were influenced by that mindset, and so influenced by his ideas. And so he saw these Marx saw these rising tensions and asserted that capitalism isn't good for all. And he argues in his Manifesto of the Communist Party that all history is a history of class struggle. And what this means is if you take a look at any historical moment, whether it's a political election where you have one person win over another, he suggests that that's mainly due to a class struggle, right? And so and I think a lot of political scientists argue that as well. It's mainly about jobs, right? Any political election is going to hinge upon what the economy is doing. But he suggests that that's the same with wars, right? We go to wars in order to find more resources. Society changes according to whatever, those that have resources versus those who don't. And so he is mainly influenced by the French Revolution, and saw that the French Revolution, kind of explaining what happened with that, was that those that were without, those that he calls the have-nots, wanted to have, right, more political influence. They wanted to have more economic capital, and they wanted to take it from those who have, right? So he suggests that generally society is oversimplified into two camps, those who have and those who don't. And those who have want to maintain what they have, while those who don't have want to gain more. And so there's this constant class struggle between those who have and those who don't. And then he says this, and this is kind of characterizes a lot of what his vision or his view of capitalism is. And I want you to think about if there's any truth to this. He says, owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work for the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. And so just stopping there for a moment, what he argues is that one of the major problems that capitalism, that industrialization has caused, is that people now have become more machines than craftsmen, right? If you think about it before, right, the Industrial Revolution, you'd have a person that, let's say, is a carpenter. He makes a table and he makes a chair, right? Those are his products. Those are his things that he makes and crafts with his hand. Then he goes and takes them to the market, or he puts them in his shop, and then he sells them, and he gets to determine how much they're going to be sold for, right? So he gets to put the price tag on it. He gets to make it. He gets to determine how much he's going to make, and then he gets to, sell it on his own. But if you work in a factory, that dynamic is changed. You don't get to determine how much you're going to produce. If you're working for, say, Ford, you don't get to determine how many cars you're going to produce. You're just on the line and you make as many cars as they tell you to. In addition to that, you don't get to determine how much the cars are going to be sold for. And so you lose that freedom, you lose that autonomy, and he suggests that you lose the aspect of what a craftsman is. And so you're losing aspects of, he considers, humanity within that. When you're just working on a line in a factory, you don't really have a lot of say. You're just another cog in the wheel, right? And so just kind of picking up on that, I wanted to finish off with this quote here. He says, he becomes an appendage of the machine and is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. And so as we think about this, as we think about most jobs out there, most minimum wage jobs, most of them are going to mainly require you to do the simplest form, the simplest function, right? So if you're working for a grocery store, say, and you're just the checkout clerk, and you're just kind of scanning in the groceries one after another, the idea of that is to simplify it to the point where if that person quits, right, that if you quit as the grocery clerk, they can put someone else in your place and they won't miss a beat, right? So that's the idea, is to oversimplify the job to a point where they can just put any person in. And again, that is another element of dehumanization that he struggles with within capitalism, right? And so I just wanted to show you a couple images from the realist movement. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about modern art and how they're reflecting some of these changes, some of these concerns of capitalism. Here we see the Third Class Wagon by Henri Daumier. And what he's arguing here is these people that are just kind of huddled together in this third-class wagon. And this old woman here is perhaps going to the downtown to sell her baskets of whatever she's made, right? Could be muffins or cookies, whatever the case may be. And this woman here, that's her child here, they're kind of all huddled together in this kind of close proximity. And I think it's interesting that the artist chooses to focus on these two women in the foreground, suggesting that the most vulnerable are going to be the ones that are most affected by these economic changes. That the economy, this kind of the propaganda of capitalism is that it's the best system for the most amount of people. But we have some serious concerns that are happening with Marx and happening with other artists. We talked about this one before when we talked about realism. with the gleaners and these individuals that are kind of coming into the field and picking up the grain that are left behind. Again, focusing on those that are vulnerable. We've talked a little bit about these just to kind of connect ideas. I want you to be able to kind of see the correlation of how these ideas are happening simultaneously, right? So these artists are representing similar ideas that Marx is seeing in the 1850s in London, and they're seeing these and Manet was in Malay, were in France, but they're seeing these changes happening throughout Europe and suggesting that is this something that's necessarily positive? I kind of like Manet's The Philosopher. It's kind of an interesting painting here. He kind of shows that this kind of interesting angle of those who are beggars or homeless. Generally, we tend to think of them within a capitalist mindset, right? The capitalist narrative would be those who are homeless because they're choosing to be homeless, right? Those that are poor are choosing to be poor because we have the bourgeoisie dream or the American dream, and that obviously is available to everyone. And so hard work and determination, if you have the grit, you're going to become successful. And that might be an oversimplification. And we tend to overlook those who are the most vulnerable, who are poor, and we kind of scoff at them for being quote unquote lazy or they have some type of other negative aspect that they're uneducated or whatever. We tend to be dismissive of rather than looking at them as human beings. We tend to be dismissive and just say, well, they just go get a job or whatever, in kind of a heartless way. But that's kind of the propaganda of what capitalism suggests, is that we should value those who are the wealthiest, because that's what we're all kind of aspiring to be. And then we tend to forget those who are the most neglected. And so here we see with Malay and Manet that they're trying to find humanity, that it's a lot more complex story. It's a lot more nuanced than we tend to give it credit for. It's interesting that he calls this particular beggar a philosopher, right? So can we learn something from taking a look in a depth look at the lives of these individuals? And I love how he casts kind of, it must be the moonlight on his face to give him this kind of glow as he kind of juxtaposes that against the darkness of the night, that gives him some type of radiance or insight that we can kind of learn from. And maybe it's not just him individually, but maybe it's looking to the problems, the more negative aspects of our society that we tend to neglect, that can help us to actually improve and to move forward. I want to take a look about the economic system as we take a look at the Russian Revolution. There's some terminology that's out there today. Socialism and communism, particularly in the United States, are deemed as, I guess, evil or whatever the case may be, and they're oversimplified. And I wanted to take a look at what each term means, so we can actually see the similarities and the differences between them. Because most of the time, we hear these words in the media in tandem. We hear them kind of together. Socialism, you're a socialist and you're a communist, right? And both of them, it's almost an ad hominem attack of an individual, where you're starting to attack the character of the individual rather than attacking the actual argument. You just dismiss the person as a communist and say, oh, therefore you're evil, and everything you say is bad, and we don't necessarily need to listen. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about the differences between these two economic systems. Socialism is an economic system, and communism is an economic and political system. And so there is a difference there, right? One is kind of more influencing the political realm. The other one, you can have a democracy and you can have socialism, and they can coexist. Communism tends to lend itself more towards dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's the case, but it tends to be much more of a political system rather than just an economic system. In socialism, what you have is the government redistributes wealth, but private ownership is allowed. And so what the government tends to do is tends to tax the people and then use those taxes to pay for things like education, pay for things like library, pay for things like healthcare, pay for things like a fire department, pay for things like security with a police department. So they take that wealth and then they try to find ways to benefit the community, and also to find ways to programs such as welfare or food programs in order to help those that are the most vulnerable, right? So it's an idea of redistributing the wealth, taking those that have all the money and the access and then taking it to those who are the most affected by the negative aspects and trying to help them. What we have but they still allow private ownership of land, and so what that means is there still can be corporations, there still can be companies within a social system, and in fact, most European forms of economic systems are socialist, and so if you take a look at Switzerland or Sweden or Finland or Germany, they have more of a socialist system, but you still have in Germany, you still have Volkswagen, you still have Mercedes, you still have BMW, right? Those are all privately owned companies, and so it still takes a look at private ownership. It just suggests that capitalism should be restrained, right? Communism is different, right? It is the complete abolition of private property. Private property is owned collectively to achieve classlessness. And so it gets back to the idea we talked about before, I think it was in week 2, where Marx argues that there can be no equality when you have classes. And so the idea is if you eliminate the classes, then you can actually have equality, because if you have a system of haves and have-nots, those that have are always going to have some type of advantage over those who don't. And so they're trying to eliminate private property to an extent, right? And so, so something to keep in mind. They're trying to eliminate private property, and then in order to say that everyone owns everything kind of collectively together. What we see within socialism is that the working class should run things collectively for the good of all. And so again, it's much more of in the United States, we're much more of an individualist culture, right? We want our individual property, we want our individual fence, we want our individual cars, right? We want to kind of own our own things. We even want our own individual food storage, right? But the idea is that in a socialist system, they're trying to reshape that rather than being a community of individuals. Let's be a collective community. And so they're trying to shape the mindset of the culture to an extent. What we see in communism is that goods and services are distributed according to the need. And so one of the major differences with communism, the reason why it's a political system in addition to an economic system, is that people give their goods and services over to the government, and then the government redistributes them to those that are in need. And the idea for this is to try to maintain equality. If you don't have a system, a entity that is able to regulate how much people get, then people are going to take advantage of the system, right? So that's the mindset, is to try to everyone gives to the government, and the government is able to then determine what the needs are, right? And then socialism is a little bit different because you still have that private ownership of land, that private ownership of companies, and so it's still of a capitalist kind of mindset. It's just more restrained. Where communism is entirely abolished capitalism and abolished private property, and the government kind of controls everything. And the reason why communism lends itself to dictatorships is because you need a strong government. You need a lot of power of the government to be able to seize people's land and property. And whenever you have people that have power, you generally have corruption of power. And so communism generally lends itself to dictatorships because you need that strong power, and then that the dictator generally, manipulates and overuses and abuses that power. And so that's why you have some of the major problems that we see within the Soviet Union. We'll talk about with Stalin, and some of the problems that we see in Venezuela and Cuba, other communist countries. Generally, that lends itself to some problems. Socialism sees capitalism, as I was mentioning, as a tool, but it's regulated. And the goal of communism is to abolish all of capitalism, right? Because they see capitalism as entirely evil, because it's going to lead to inequality. So the whole idea of communism is to try to get to that equality. And most of the communist systems that are out there or have been out there have not really achieved this. Most political scientists take a look at the Soviet Union and say it wasn't really communism, quote unquote, as Karl Marx suggested. It was more of a Soviet capitalism, because they were still a system of those that had a lot of wealth, a lot of power, a lot of influence, and a lot of money. And then there was just everybody else, which was in poverty. And so most people say that they didn't quite attain that idea of communism. But there are some definite problems, right? So there's some definite problems to capitalism, there's some problems to socialism, and there's some problems to communism, right? So just wanted to lay those out. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Russian Revolution and some of the changes that were happening. So here's just an overview of some of the major talking points that I wanted to talk about that we'll get into in the upcoming slides. But a lot of the economic changes that we saw with the Industrial Revolution and the political changes that we saw with the French and the American Revolution and the other revolutions that were happening throughout Europe in the 19th century. By the 20th century, these changes had not happened in Russia yet, and so Tsar Nicholas Romanov II had absolute power over political and economic matters, and the people of Russia had little voice in their government. So in a lot of ways, the Russia was still back in the 18th century in that kind of mindset. Yet the Russian monarchs were trying to keep revolution at bay, but they couldn't keep it at bay for long, right? Because you have this growing demand for equality, growing demand for power. As Russia struggled to modernize due to its vastness and outdated ways, the people were growing discontent with the prevailing system, and they were demanding revolution. I wanted to take a look at, Alexander Nicholas II is the main person I'm going to talk about, but I want to talk about his grandfather. One of Nicholas II's earliest memories was the assassination of his grandfather, Alexander II of Russia. He was traveling home one day and a bomb hit his carriage. And so that's that idea, again, of this, the people were pushing for change. They wanted to eliminate the monarch or the czar of Russia. They wanted to find a new political voice. And so this was emblazed upon Nicholas II's mind as he saw, as he was entered into, so this is Nicholas II, who we're mainly going to be focusing on for the Russian Revolution as a child. He was kind of put into his father's bed. So they took Alexander II home and they put him in his bed. And then they had Nicholas II come by and kind of say, goodbye. But I mean, he was in not a good shape. His insides were out. It was kind of a gruesome sight, and his eyes were kind of glazed over and white. And so it wasn't the best way to say goodbye, not the kind of the best memory to have. But this was the memory that Nicholas II had of his grandfather, of revolution, of assassinations, of political changes, of reform, and so he became familiar with revolution even at an early age. And interestingly enough, as kind of the last czar of Russia, he never really had any aspirations for politics. He never wanted to aspire to be czar. He spent most of his childhood avoiding government responsibilities, and for the most part, he was more interested in courting another young aristocrat from, I believe it's Germany, don't quote me on that, but her name was Alexandra Fyodorovna. And she was the granddaughter of the Queen Victoria of England. And so, as the case tends to happen, most of the royal family in Europe are related. And so, she does have ties to Germany. She has ties to England. And for the most part, he was just mainly interested in courting her. And they kind of sending each other love letters back and forth. And he was, not really that interested in becoming, the next czar. But by the time his father, Alexander III, was assassinated, Nicholas was thrust into the public sphere. Now, he is this public figure. He is the leader of Russia, and Russia at a time of change, a time of revolution. But he was completely unprepared to lead the countries at one of the most pivotal times with this increasing pressure to end the monarchy. He soon married Alexandra after his father's death, and in order to kind of demonstrate this power, this unity of Russia, it was kind of more of a political son, even though he's going to marry her anyway. It was the close proximity of marrying her to his own father's death was mainly a kind of a political political idea in order to kind of reassert strength within the monarchy. But Alexandra once wrote in her journal how closely the funeral of Alexander III and her wedding were. that they actually felt so similar, right? Both of them were kind of somber, both of them were kind of quiet. And she said, the only difference was for my wedding day, I traded a black dress for a white one. And so, kind of an interesting, this is going to overshadow this idea of revolution, assassinations are going to overshadow much of their time together, much of their marriage and their reign. But the learning curve for both of them is going to be steep as they're trying to begin their reign in one of the most challenging parts in Russian history. I want to talk about Bloody Sunday. After a failed war against Japan between Japan and Russia in 1904, there was pressure at home that was continuing to increase to change for political reform and to end the monarchy. One of the first major domestic challenges that Nicholas faced was economic discontent. People wanted to work less hours and have better pay, and there were strikes that were beginning to arise throughout Russia, closing stores and factories, and so you see some major economic problems that were on the horizon. And on Sunday, January 22nd, 1905, the people formed a mass demonstration to get their grievances out and addressed by the Tsar. And some estimate that the crowd numbered about 50,000 people. So here you just see an artist's rendition of this kind of protest. Nicholas became nervous when he saw the rising tension in the growing mob and began to mobilize his army. However, rather than quieting the crowd, right, and that's kind of what he thought, is he says, if I bring out my military, then everyone's going to go home. But rather than doing that, the people started freaking out more. And so they grew more and more anxious. And so the military said, well, what can we do to quiet the crowd? And so they decided to fire a volley over the heads of the protesters. So they're just kind of over their heads to try to scare them away, to disperse. But the problem was that there were some trees off into the distance that the volley then entered, the rounds entered into. And there were some people that were in the trees trying to see over the crowd to see what was going on, and it killed them instantly, and they fell to the ground, which created, again, mass panic, right? So then at that point, the military decided to open fire on the crowd, and they killed about 3,000 people on what is known as Bloody Sunday. And this event further questioned the people's faith in Nicholas as the ruler of Russia and his ability to rule. And they just seen him as inept and a failed monarch. He finally agreed as a result of this event to kind of quiet things down. He agreed to form a constitutional monarchy to limit his power and to give some authority to the White Party, which is another kind of growing political party in Russia. And this quieted the revolutionary sentiments for a time. But Nicholas became firmly believed that signing away his control would lead to the end of Russia. And some people kind of see that as, well, that's just kind of a bitter monarch saying, he just loses his legacy. But in some ways, he was correct, right? So this is going to lead to actually his demise, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But this is just an actual photograph of of Bloody Sunday, the protesters, the firing on the mob, and one of the sad moments in Russian history. But before long, Russia found themselves pulled into World War I, which we've talked about a couple weeks ago, and they found themselves desperately ill-equipped and underprepared. The military faced vast shortages of supplies and food. Nicholas traveled to the front in order to command his troops, as this idea of, I want to be with my men, I want to show my strength. He's always kind of trying to prove himself. But the problem with that is then he leaves most of the political events then to his wife to rule, who the Russians didn't really see her as inept, or didn't really see her as adept or savvy either. They just really felt that Nicholas, now he's fighting this war that we don't agree with, and now he's abandoned us fighting on the front lines for his own glory. And so it didn't really help his public image at all at home. And so they at home, even worse, they felt that Alexandra was a spy for Germany because she was a cousin to the German king. And so that didn't really help the Romanovs' image as well. They just thought that she was a spy and that she's going to undermine all of Russia. Never mind the fact that Nicholas was also a cousin to the German leaders. They didn't really focus on that, but they focused more on her. But the problem at home is that they were facing, as well, as that they kept hearing all of these horror stories of people coming back from the war, telling about how bad the war was. And again, people were starting to question, why are we in this war? And the Romanovs got us into this war. The king is inept and leading us to our own destruction. And so that's another major problem that they're facing. An additional problem was this individual here, this handsome little guy. His name was Rasputin. He was as they were, facing these socio-political changes that Alexandra and Nicholas II were trying to kind of stave off. Their fifth child, Alexei, seen here, was born with hemophilia. And a lot of nobles in the Europe were hemophiliacs because of the small bloodline that they have. They only can marry certain nobility. That the gene of hemophilia carried throughout many of the nobles. But at the time, right, at the turn of the 20th century, hemophilia was a death sentence that most people didn't live to see adulthood. And if you don't know what a hemophilia is, that means that your blood doesn't clot, and so any minor cut can actually, cause grave concerns because you can just bleed to death. And so Alexei was constantly sick throughout most of his childhood. This was the only son that Alexandra and Nicholas II had, and so he was kind of the future of the Russian monarchy. And Alexandra mainly sheltered him from a lot of normal child activities. She tried to protect him from getting hurt, as you would think, and he was just trying to be a boy. And but what Alexandra tried to do as well is she tried to protect the diagnosis of his condition from Russians, because she believed that if most Russians knew about his condition, they would see this as a weakened bloodline. This would be further evidence of the Romanovs' failures, and so she kept a lot of that from the public eye. So most people didn't know about it. But what happens is he was constantly sick, and so she tries everything. She goes to doctors, and the doctors really can't help him. So then she hears about this spiritual healer off in Siberia named Rasputin, and she calls him to come to the palace and take a look at her son. And at this point, the son was bed-stricken, and he was it looked like he was gravely ill. And Rasputin says, well, what medical things, what procedures have you done? And she said, told him what the doctors have advised her to do. And then he goes and whispers something in Alexei's ear, and then turns to Alexandra and says, do nothing what the doctors say, and he'll be healed within 3 days, right? And 3 days later, right, whatever it was that he said or did, or just naturally, he got better, Alexei did get better. And so this proved to Alexandra that Rasputin was this spiritual healer, that he had this kind of mystical power. But while he was, gaining more and more influence within the Romanov family, he was kind of getting into their inner circles. Alexandra was turning to her for more and more advice. More and more pictures of Rasputin were emerging, with him in compromising positions, and photos of him as a womanizer starting to emerge. And so people started to see this individual coming into the Romanov family, and they had grave concerns about how much influence this person actually was having. And they believed that that Nicholas and Alexandra were just becoming puppets of this charlatan or this con man who is now influencing the family. And it's uncertain how much control he actually had over them. But what is important is that the perception of the control that he had over them. And so while Nicholas was fighting the war and Alexandra was at home dealing with domestic issues, and coming closer and closer to Rasputin, they had more and more concerns from the people about the direction of where the Romanovs are leading Russia. So as these concerns started to arise, there became a an attempt in order to eliminate Rasputin. And one woman from Siberia tried to kill him by stabbing him in the stomach. It didn't work, but he was severely wounded. And this perhaps made him a little bit more paranoid. Rasputin, sensing the opposing forces against him, warned Alexandra that if any of her family members were involved in a plot to kill him, that the entire family would be dead within 2 years of his assassination. And interestingly enough, 2 years after the assassination attempt by the woman, Nicholas's cousins conspire to kill Rasputin in an attempt to save the family's reputation. So now you have Nicholas's family saying, "Hey, this is not good PR for us. We need to get rid of him." And so they invited him over. And so Felix, who is Nicholas's cousin, invited Rasputin over to his house and gave him some tea and cake laced with cyanide. When the cyanide had no effect, Felix then poisoned Rasputin's wine. After 3 glasses, Rasputin still showed no signs of being poisoned. Felix then shot him 3 times. He then disguised himself as Rasputin, kind of put on his coat, and went back to Rasputin's apartment to make it look like Rasputin returned home in order to cover his tracks. Then he went back to his house to dispose of the body. And as he was picking up the body and dragging it across the floor, Rasputin kind of, moved forward, kind of came to be, and kind of, came back and, moved around and then struggled and then ran out the door. And then as he was leaving, he was shot once more. And then Felix dumped Rasputin's body into a river in Russia. And then they later found his body, and an autopsy report, this is kind of interesting about Rasputin. An autopsy shown that there was no trace of poison in his body, and the gunshots and the stabbings didn't kill him, and he had no water in his lungs, and so he didn't drown. And so then the mystery, the legacy of Rasputin kind of continues on of how did he die, right? It's kind of this mysterious figure. We're not really sure, but the element that's important about Rasputin is that he further questions the king's ability to rule and how much control the Romanovs have over Russia. Nicholas II in March 1917 decided to abdicate the throne. He says, "I don't want this anymore. I sense that these revolutionary trends, this mounting opposition against me, is just going to continue to grow." And so he just says, "You know what, I'm done." And he wanted his brother to be the next Tsar, but his brother, thought the better of it. He says, "I don't want anything to do with that." And this left Nicholas's only son, Alexei, to rule. However, he was much too young and sickly. So as a result, no one from the family was left to rule. And so the White Party effectively took control of Russia. And this is where we have the introduction of Vladimir Lenin. He came through a family of revolutionaries. His brother Alexander was part of the assassination plot to kill Nicholas's father, Alexander III, and he was later executed for it. And so Lenin's family was part of the assassinations and part of this change. He followed in his brother's footsteps, but due to his revolutionary ideas, he was exiled from Russia and came to live in Switzerland for the early part of the 20th century. While he was there, he was still promoting revolutionary ideas. He published a paper called The Spark, which was promoting, revolution and change in Russia. And during World War I, the German officials believed that if we send this character back to Russia, if we fund him to get back, then he could start a revolution in Russia. And if we start a revolution in Russia, maybe Russia will get out of the war, right? So that's kind of the German mindset of send him back, have him create a revolution, and then we can then end the war, at least on the Russian front. According to legend, when Lenin came back, he was heralded by all these crowds of people that were just shouting and cheering for him. when in fact, in reality, it was just a couple of friends and family that met him at the train station. But as he came back, he did ignite this revolution. He did ignite this spark that created this major change. And essentially, what he did is he organized a group of people called the Bolsheviks, and they showed up one day at the government building. And the whites kind of saw the change, and they just kind of laid down their weapons. And so, for the most part, it wasn't really a bloody revolution. It was kind of, the people saw the change happening, and communism just kind of promoted, or just kind of came from it. But then there was a growing question of what to do with the Romanovs. As he's in control, the question is, what do we do with this, this ruling family? So what he decided to do is he decided to exile the Romanovs, Nicholas II and Alexandra and their daughters and their son to Siberia. But then, with the changes, the political changes, you have to also get rid of the family. You can't just have the family kind of off in the background, off in the shadows, because people are going to start to say, well, weren't things better, right, way back when we had a czar? And so the whole idea is that we need to now get rid of them. And so he ordered the assassination of the Romanovs on July 16th, 1918. And the assassins shot the entire family. They mutilated their bodies and put their remains in sulfuric acid. And the idea of this is to try to leave nothing left that people can then use as some type of artifact, or some type of remnant, some type of clinging to the past. And then he buried them in unmarked graves. Kind of an interesting part of the story, though, is that a team of researchers later found the graves, I think in the 1990s. And they dug up them. They conducted DNA tests, and they concluded that they were the remains of the Romanovs. However, only Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their 4 daughters' remains were found. And so, one daughter was not found, and so that kind of leads to the myth of Anastasia. Some of you have seen the Disney movie Anastasia, and some of the myths about what happened to Alexei, right? So there's still some kind of mystery surrounding the Romanov family to this day. And so kind of interesting what happened with them. We don't really know. Some of the other responses, and we'll kind of close with this, the artist's responses to the Russian Revolution. George Orwell's Animal Farm is kind of a representation, although it's done through animals, but it's a representation of the Russian Revolution. It was published in 1945. Orwell satirically portrays the events of the Russian Revolution with animals forming a revolt against their farmer. What starts as a campaign for the unity and equality of animals quickly regresses to tyranny led by a pig named Napoleon, which is kind of a metaphor for Stalin. Napoleon, master of ideology, uses propaganda to encourage the animals to work together to one day achieve a utopian farm where everyone can live in peace. But such ideals always seem just beyond their reach. The question of the novel is whether Napoleon's farm is better or worse than that of the neighboring human capitalist farms. And so we see kind of an interesting commentary on these two economic systems, the capitalist farm by the humans versus the communist farms by the animals. And he's exposing that both of them are using propaganda, both of them are exploiting workers, both of them have problems. And one of the main lines from Animal Farm is, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And so that's kind of the running joke that kind of takes a look at the Russian Revolution as, promoting this equality just seemed beyond their reach. And so we'll take a look at the next lecture. We'll take a look at the art of the Russian Revolution and Stalinist art to take a look at how artists are capturing this experience.